Hello, and welcome back to Quarks and Quarter Notes. Today, Tyler and I will be discussing the physical components of sounds and what makes different sounds distinct. As always, if you enjoy the podcast and like to support us, you can follow us on whatever platform you're listening on, along with leaving us comments or feedback. We sort of touched on this a little bit in our first episode where we talked about the difference between melody and harmony, but I want to get actually a lot more specific. So individual notes and what makes them sound different, because you can play the same note on a lot of different instruments and it's going to sound really different. Why does it sound different is the question.
We've decided to name the different parts of a sound. So I'm obviously not trained in any of this, but when I hear a C on a piano and then I play a C on a guitar, they're both a C, and I would say the texture of the sound is different. What would you say?
Yeah, that's a good place to start. So the pitch itself is the same, but the intensity and timbre, which are the other two qualities of the sound, could be different. The intensity could even be the same, but the timbre is really the key difference there in terms of like what you're thinking of as the texture.
Right. So the difference between a piano making its note in a guitar or a violin or something, that's in the timbre.
Yeah, and we can break down what the timbre is in a sec, but first I want to touch on something that you just said is the pitch. You said we've sort of agreed that certain pitches are called certain things, and that's actually the interesting part. So the first component of a sound, of course, is the pitch. But the pitch is really referring to the perception of the sounds, which is interesting because it's the perception of a sound. It's not necessarily an objective sort of thing, because a C is only a C if we agree it's a C. We can say it's a certain frequency, but not everyone might agree on what frequency is a C, if that makes sense. There's this weird subjective aspect of it. We can agree on what's higher and what's lower, but agreeing on which notes are which, it's actually pretty tricky because we can't really, it's not as simple as like counting things, you know?
Well, it seems a tiny bit arbitrary, right? Like, we decide what sound is a C. There's no like C out there in the world that we discover.
Yeah, well, they could easily be different letters, but they also could be different frequencies. Like, imagine if we just shifted all the notes over by like 1 megahertz or something, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So it's an interesting thing. So there's an element of subjectivity in when you're talking about pitch, in that you actually can have genuine disagreements over what a C actually is, and there are people who disagree on that.
Right. But but all piano players agree that special key right there in the center of the keyboard or piano is a C, right? That's not what they're worrying about.
Yeah, by mutual agreement, but even so, you know, you can tune a keyboard slightly differently. There's this interesting thing that you'll see in rock music and stuff. You're probably familiar with this. You know, people tune their guitar half a step down.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of musicians,
Stevie Ray Vaughan.
Yeah, Stevie Ray Vaughan with those thick strings. A lot of musicians they'll call that E-flat tuning, and in some ways they'll acknowledge that they're down half a step, but in a lot of other practical ways they really don't, you know? Like if you ask a guy playing half a step down, playing a C chord, what chord he's playing, he's not going to tell you he's playing a C flat. He's going to tell you he's playing a C, and in some sense C becomes a new note. And if that makes sense, it's very unusual.
It does.
But of course, if you like push them on it, like, oh, is that actually a C? And he might be like, oh, well, I'm tuned half a step down. But it's interesting because in practice, the C has become a new note. So that's interesting.
So whenever I think of pitch, I think of like that's not talking about how loud the note is. That's talking about the frequency of the note.
Right. So how fast the sound wave is moving.
Right. Okay. Pitch. That's interesting. We would just say frequency in physics.
Yeah. Well, so that's again, this gets at this weird difference because you can quantify pitch as a frequency. But pitch is not frequency. Pitch is our perceptual experience of certain frequencies.
Okay. Okay, I see. So we can say it's like 500 hertz or whatever. We can all agree that it's 500 hertz. We don't know what note that is, though.
Right. But 500 hertz isn't a note.
Right, exactly.
It's
Well, it
almost
corresponds to some note,
yeah,
but
it's
it's
sort
not the
of
note.
it's a bit like the hard problem of consciousness, you know? You have like these experiences you can call certain things, and we can't really we can look at brains and we can, compare what a brain looks like when it's
Mm-hmm.
experiencing this thing, and we can correlate, but there's still like a gap there. It's a very similar thing right here between pitch and frequency.
Right. Okay.
We
So pitch is like more subjective. That's very interesting.
Yeah, exactly. You
Well,
and
you
I
need that whenever you're like making music, it's good to have I think it's a good starting spot to assume like the subjective stance.
yeah.
Because that's like what you're making music for.
Yeah. And this gets at some of the reasons that we have different musical tastes, because you and I experience a string vibrating at 280 hertz differently. So that's one potential area where we might end up liking different things because we actually experience the pitch differently.
So say a C is like around 300 hertz, but like to me it sounds better at 320, but for you it sounds better at like 315.
Really, the heart of it is that we can both be hearing a 300 hertz note. And for one, there's no way to know whether we're actually hearing the same, experiencing the same thing, you know?
Right. Well, that's a hard question.
And yeah, but from like asking people what they think and playing sounds for people and testing this sort of stuff out, you do get at some point where it's like we don't agree exactly on how this sounds. There's broad overlap on how we agree how this sounds, but there are discrepancies, and that's weird.
Right. There's like a bit of uncertainty in there.
Yeah, exactly. But the one thing we can agree on is when things are higher and when things are lower. And that's where we get our agreement on what to call things.
Oh, well, that makes sense.
Yeah, because that is the part that we can quantify with frequency.
So when we're thinking about like the anatomy of the sound, how many categories would you say there is? Like pitch seems to be a category when we're thinking about how to break up this sound.
Yeah, we have pitch, and then we have timbre, which you alluded to earlier with the quality difference between a piano and a guitar. And then there's the intensity, which is pretty straightforward. You're just talking about how loud you are. Not necessarily the loudness change over time, but how loud the specific note is. Because you can play the same note and have it sound the exact same way, but have it be slightly louder or slightly quieter. And that can change how something sounds.
Right. So like pressing the piano key softly versus like really pressing it.
Yeah, and you could do that same thing on the guitar, and you could listen to the same pitch and the same intensity on a guitar and piano with no difference, and you could isolate the timbre as being the only difference, or you could have any of those things be
You
different.
can have same pitch and different intensity.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Or you could also have the same pitch and same timbre, but a different intensity.
Well, we'll have to talk about timbre
Yeah.
because that's the part that I'm really interested in is this timbre, this texture part of the note.
Yeah, so pitch is easy. We're just talking about higher and lower notes. Intensity is pretty straightforward too, but timbre is the unusual one and the one people aren't as familiar with. So let's break it down. It breaks up into two categories, harmonics and the envelope. Can start with the harmonics. So what do you think of whenever I'm talking about harmonics?
I think of, well, lately simple harmonic motion that's periodic, and the way the period of the motion changes is it comes in like steps. So when I think of harmonics, I think of like a bass waveform, and then the harmonics of that are like half of that waveform, and then a third of that waveform, and a fourth of that waveform. If that makes sense.
I think so. When you're talking about a bass waveform, you're just talking about like a low waveform, or are you talking about like?
I'm thinking just like a straight up sine wave that just does like one oscillation.
Mm-hmm.
And then I think of like the first harmonic in the range where the first wave used to do one oscillation. The first harmonic it does two oscillations in the same amount of time.
Gotcha.
So it's just like a little bit. And then the second harmonic would be like it can do three oscillations in the normal time it would take to do one. That's what I think of harmonic.
Gotcha. That's very similar to the kind of thing I'm talking about. Harmonic is like a very broad word, and it does mean a whole lot of different things. On stringed instruments, harmonic can mean it's just whenever you touch over the string rather than pushing down, and you get a certain sound. But you actually have harmonics every time you play any note. And you can think of this as whenever I play a C for you, you hear the fundamental frequency most prominently, so like the C itself.
The actual C.
But the overall sound, it's colored by the presence of various overtones. So
colored, you mean like flavored?
Yeah, like in the background, behind it quieter.
Right. Gives it a bit of substance.
Yeah, and they're frequencies that are greater than the fundamental frequency. So and it goes a lot like how you're saying, and as you get higher, it goes down to like a half and then a third, and it just keeps decaying. But as far as your experience, you experience that as one note.
There will not be so for these like supporting notes in the background, there's not going to be one of a lower frequency.
Your fundamental frequency, as far as I understand it, should always be your lowest because...
Okay.
Yeah. If you think about it, whenever you play on a guitar, like you play like any note, the note behind it, the lower notes, they don't ring. They literally can't ring. But all the higher notes are ringing with the note you're playing.
Well, it makes sense that it can't ring like slower than like your fundamental note, right? Because that's the one that's like, that's the big boy. That's carrying everybody.
Yeah, that's sending the energy, and then it just decays as it gets
higher.
Wait.
Oh, I see. Okay, so that makes sense.
Because you're starting your waveform at that note.
Right.
So there can't be anything lower. Different instruments have different overtone sequences, but we can actually visualize and hear this. So I'm going to go ahead, and I've recorded a C note on my guitar. I'm just going to play it for you real quick. So this is just a C on my classical guitar played with my nail. That's the whole note. It sounds a lot like you could play a dum on the piano, and it would sound relatively similar, minus some of those extra textures. If you do have video, you can see the waveform here, and it's going from the lower frequencies on the left to the higher frequencies on the right. It starts off at this ambient 50, 100, 200 frequencies. That's just the ambient noise in the room for the most part. It's a little bit on the guitar. And then you can see this first peak here at the 200 and 300 mark. And then you see more peaks and dips. And this is just the overall texture of the sound. And these are the different frequencies, the different notes at different frequencies.
So where it peaks, the very first peak, right before 300 right there, do you see that?
Right.
That is your fundamental frequency?
Yes.
That's your major note that's being played right there.
Right. That's
around that 300 hertz range.
It's the C4 is at 262 hertz.
Right.
And that's pretty much right where we're getting our peak.
And so we've done a tiny bit of an experiment here where we tested what frequency the C was, and it does turn out to be about 260 if you look right there.
And you can actually see as it gets higher and higher, the frequencies get lower and lower.
The frequencies get higher?
The amplitudes of the frequencies get lower
right.
as the frequency gets higher.
And these higher frequencies, if you change the loudness of this note, so I guess the intensity of this note, would it have more or less the same peaks at the same spots?
Yes, correct. So intensity is not a quality of timbre, it is a quality of the sound itself. So you would just see all these, but they would be higher or they would be lower.
It would
And
just be higher or lower. It's
and
okay.
I can actually show you this just by literally increasing the volume. So for example, I could play the sound again on repeat a couple times, and I can increase the volume, and you're still getting the same waveform no matter what.
It's the exact same waveform. Oh, okay. Very interesting. And so where all these little peaks are behind the first one,
Mm-hmm.
those are unique to your instrument?
Yeah, different instruments are going to have different sorts of waveforms. A piano's going to look really different. A synth is going to look really different. A drum is going to look really different.
And, well, I guess even on guitar, you could change the shape of the waveform.
Correct.
Right, by playing closer to the bridge, maybe.
Yeah, well, you'll get similar waveforms for the most part. Whenever you play closer to the bridge or higher up the neck, you do change how it sounds, but this is a bit more of the second quality of timbre, which is the envelope. Not so much the harmonics.
Okay. Not the harmonics.
I do have another note here, same note, C1, but this is me playing closer to the bridge. And you can see it is a little bit different. I'll do that again. So here's the first one, and then here's the second one. You can see they more or less follow the same pattern. There are some slight differences, especially at these higher frequencies, and that's where you get the actual pick sound,
Oh, I see.
which is going to be amplified here. But because that will be more evident when we look at the envelope, but here in the harmonics, you are still getting a very similar picture.
Yeah, the peaks are still more or less at the same spot. Oh, that's fascinating. So they don't really change.
Yeah, well, that difference is confined to the envelope more or less, which we will look at in a sec. But first, I want to show you a little bit more on the harmonics. So what we can do with our technology is we can actually isolate some of these sounds and hear them on their own. So I'm just going to play this on repeat a couple times, and I'm going to show you how it sounds in different areas. So again, this is the basic sound.
Right.
Now right at our C4, you can hear just that C. Are you able to hear that?
Mm-hmm.
And there you're pretty much getting a raw C.
So whenever you play the note on the guitar, a single note, it's not a single note being played.
Right, it's all these other notes.
There's a whole bunch of stuff going on in that note.
We can look at this other peak here on the B, which, not surprisingly, the very next note. Oh, sorry, I said the wrong thing. The D.
The D, right. And so the notes that are played underneath the fundamental note are the harmonics of it?
Yeah.
Dang, but that's playing whenever you play the note, though. That's crazy. And so this is true for like any stringed instrument? It's just going to have those...
It's true for any instrument. The only exception, I suppose, would be a synthesizer, because in a synthesizer you can get the pure note. Yeah, exactly. And you can shape it in a way to where you get really unusual sounds. So that's harmonics in a nutshell. And one other interesting thing about them is that they are discrete.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like a gradual change. You can see that on the waveform itself. Like you've said before about fundamental particles and them being discrete. So
discrete
is sound.
Energies. Yep.
Discrete energy levels, yeah, right. You don't gradually change energy, you hop over it. It's the same thing here. You don't have a gradual... It's not just like a wave going down,
Mm-hmm.
starting from the highest and gradually shifting down. You peak, you go down, you go up, and then we get to the next note, you go up again.
Mm-hmm.
And we get to the next note, you go up again.
You peak at like 300 hertz, you peak at like 500 hertz. Well, that makes sense, because like in quantum, what you call the fundamental frequency, we would say the ground state, or like the ground energy. That would be like your lowest, and that would be like peaking at like 300. And then like your next excited state, specifically when you're talking about like an electron, it has like a ground state, lowest energy, and then its next excited state would be like the next frequency, right? And it can only occupy like like one or the other state and nothing in between. And if we look at the waveform, there is nothing in between those two peaks. It's just like there's a peak and then it goes down and then there's another peak. And there's just no sound between those two.
It's almost like a quality of our universe in a lot of ways. This is just how stuff works.
It's like the mechanics of waves. I never understood waves. Waves are everywhere in nature. Just these sinusoidal, just up and down, like everywhere. Like that's like what nature is essentially. Is just a bunch of waves floating through the universe and interacting with each other in complicated ways.
I find it really interesting too because it is quite unintuitive. Because intuitively, you should just start here at high energy or high sound,
and then get
or low frequency, and then you would just think it'd fall off. And that's how it sounds, whenever you just listen experientially. That's what it feels like.
Yep, you definitely don't hear those little
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
How could you?
But yeah, it's another way to show how our instincts don't necessarily pair well with the way our universe works on like a very technical level.
Right. Just wave mechanics. It's so strange just how they work. And what's strange to me is how broad of a description they give us. We use wave mechanics and just normal like fluid dynamics and physics. We use the quantum. I mean, you guys in music use wave mechanics. Y'all aren't trying to describe them, but y'all are definitely making use of some of the mechanics behind them and how they interact.
So one way you would use the frequencies is with EQ. If you've ever seen the DJ with like the big mixer sliding the things up, what he's doing is he's sliding up these different frequencies to boost certain ones and lower certain ones and craft his wave function to sound better.
Right.
Although a lot of those DJs, they don't necessarily understand what's happening, but they have really good ears and they sort of intuitively can hear which frequencies need to go up and down, and
they're making the situation work.
Yeah.
Right.
Which is cool. It's a very useful skill. It's not one I actually have. I do have to go in there and do the calculations. I don't have the ear for that, so I have a lot of respect for people who do.
They just make the EQ sound great. And that's like turning up. So I understand EQ very basically. Like on my amp, I have like treble, mid, and bass that I can turn up. And that's interesting. I never thought about that. You're not changing. You can't change the note by changing or that would just mess up everything. You're just changing the loudness of some of the harmonics of the notes you're playing. Something like that.
Correct. Okay, so that's timbre, and that explains a lot of the differences between different instruments.
That's harmonics.
They just have different harmonic sequences. The violin has different peaks, the piano has different peaks. But there is another part of the picture, and that's the envelope, the envelope is the change over time in amplitude.
Amplitude being like loudness?
Correct. So it's not the overall. We mentioned before how you could raise and lower the intensity and you'd keep the same frequency rate waveform.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than the overall volume, this is the change in volume over time that we're looking at. The other thing, all you see is the current volume basically and how loud each frequency is. But this is how loud and quiet the whole thing goes over the course of the note's life.
Right. And so the C that we were looking at the harmonics with, it'll just start out loud and then get quieter over time.
Right. Well, there's a little bit more to it, and it's kind of hard to see on just a guitar, but I'll do my best. So the first part is the attack.
The attack.
First part of the envelope.
Okay.
So that's how long it takes from the sound to start to it to get its peak. So if you see the beginning of the waveform, if you're looking on the video, you can see the sound starts just like half a second before it actually peaks. When you hear it, it sort of feels like it comes out of nowhere, but there is a bit of a build up there, and that's the attack part. And different instruments have different attacks. This is really exemplified in... I can show you the difference on the attack on my guitar in two ways. So for this first note, it's the same note playing my classical in the middle position with an L. Now on the second one, I play right by the bridge with a pick. Now what that does is that significantly changes the attack, the very first part. If you only listen to that, the attack of the first note is much softer versus...
It's like a little bit more aggressive sounding.
Yeah, and that's the sound of the pick hitting. This part of the envelope, the attack, it accounts for a lot of differences between, for one, on guitar, from different types of guitars and different picks and finger picks and things like that, but also different instruments. A violin or other bowed instruments like it, like the cello and stuff, on this part of the waveform, they have a much longer attack because they take a long time to get from the beginning to their peak.
Oh, they build up slower.
This
one's like almost instantaneously.
Correct. Yeah, guitars are notorious for having very quick attacks. And drums as well, other percussive instruments.
Well, that makes
very, very fast attack.
I can't imagine it any other way on a drum.
Yeah, but even if you look at a drum beat, you will still see this little like build up, basically. So that's the first part, is the attack. The next part is the decay, and that's how long it takes to go from the peak to the sustained part of the note. So see how it basically stays at this volume for a long time?
Right.
I mean, there's a very tiny change, but more or less the same. That's the sustain part. So different instruments will also have different links on the sustain. And they'll have different decays, which is the time it takes for it to go from the peak to the sustain part. And then lastly, we have the release, and that's how long it takes to go from the sustain part, which is kind of that part in the middle, down to the nothing.
Right, okay.
So these are the four components of your amplitude over time: the attack, decay, sustain, release. Every sound has all four of these, and different instruments and different ways of playing those instruments gives you a different shape.
Why is it that whenever I'm playing like an electric guitar, the sustain is way longer than like an acoustic?
What your electric guitar typically does is it compresses the signal a bit, so that means it makes the louder noises quieter and the quieter noises louder.
Oh, I see.
So you end up with
a
lot of sustain that way. And that's one of the reasons an electric guitar sounds different from an acoustic guitar.
Is in the sustain? Or just in the envelope as a whole?
I would in the envelope as a whole, but definitely the sustain and release. It's got a longer sustain. It's got a longer release.
Right.
It's really cool, and with lots of different effects and such in music, especially on guitars and other instruments, you manipulate these four aspects of the envelope. All reverb, compressor, all those sorts of effects, they typically have an attack, a decay, sustain, a release setting.
Oh, very interesting. So like you said, compressing it makes the sustain appear to be a bit longer.
It does a lot of things, but what it does is it brings up the lows and reduces the highs, and it sort of makes it a little more even.
Across the whole, yeah. It seems like you miss a lot when you do that from the original sound.
It's true, you do lose something, but it becomes a little bit easier to listen to because you don't have these dramatic changes. If you look at, say, classical music, you'll see really big ups and downs and really different. But if you look at pop music, it's highly, highly compressed. So, for example, here is just I Ran by a Flock of Seagulls.
Mm-hmm.
You can see how there aren't really low points and high points. Yeah. It's pretty much the same throughout.
That's insane.
And the more contemporary you get, typically the more compressed it gets. So that's 80s, if you can imagine. This is Avicii.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And then let me go back a little bit and I'll give you some classical music. So here's classical music. Of course, it was recorded in a contemporary setting where you can see it's much more dynamic. You have like high points and then it goes down to basically nothing. Or here, even the Avicii, where you go to like the quietest point of the song, it's still so that shows you the difference in compression. It's not necessarily related. It's related in that it's manipulation of the envelope of the whole piece rather than individual notes.
If you look
it adds up to that.
If you look at the character of the of the wave, the classical piece has character. And like the other two are kind of boring, right?
Well, yeah, if you're looking at just that
Right,
mark of
exactly.
musicianship, and that's because in classical music they cared a lot more about the intensity and the envelope and have being really dynamic with it. Where in the modern setting we've sort of dropped that. We don't care as much about being really dynamic in terms, just as long as you have like a dip and then like a big, like bass hit or drop or
Right.
whatever. That's about as dynamic as you get in contemporary music, and it's just sort of a difference of taste, and that really makes up all the difference between every sound. When you take the envelope like that, you take the harmonics, and that gives you the timbre, and then between the timbre, the pitch, the intensity, you get a sound. Those are all the qualities of a sound that you can have.
Pitch, intensity, and timbre.
Yeah.
And texture is texture even like a technical word?
Well, typically when you talk about musical texture, you're talking about the whole music. You're not talking about individual notes anymore.
Okay, so we've broken it up currently into, so we talked about pitch and intensity. So pitch is like how we hear the sound. Intensity is like how loud the sound is. And then timbre is, like you said, your harmonics, which each note has its set of harmonics behind it that kind of support it. And then you have the envelope, which determines the actual
Change in sound over time. So it's
change in
intensity
sound.
over time as a function of time.
Or change in intensity.
Well, not necessarily change in intensity. I probably shouldn't conflate them because, you can have the same envelope with different intensities.
Oh, right.
Right? Because if I could play this note louder or quieter, but it would still have the same attack and release and sustain and such.
It would still, yeah. Oh, okay.
It would just all be a little bit louder.
Oh, okay. So whenever you were doing that demonstration of playing it softly and then near the bridge with a pick, essentially what you did was just change the attack of the envelope and then not much of anything else, right?
Yeah, because really the only difference I'm doing with the note, right, is at the very, very beginning.
Right. Because afterwards,
After that, the note's the same.
Afterwards, yeah, the note's going to do what it does on the guitar. The input was what was slightly different. Okay, so like pitch, intensity, and timbre are essentially like how we break apart individual sounds. Well, that pretty much answers all the questions I had on, like, I don't know what to call it, sound anatomy.
Musical anatomy.
Yeah.
I think pretty much every difference in musical sound can be attributed between these things. There's basically no other lever you can pull.
Well, that makes sense because I mean that's a sound wave. Like there's only so many ways to manipulate it.
That basically is a description of a sound wave and a description even of how we experience the sound wave, because these are, when you're talking about pitch specifically, that's the perception aspect of it. Although the rest of these are basically completely objective. Intensity, decibel levels, like there's no subjectivity there. And even the timbre, when we're talking about the harmonics and the envelope, there's really no room for subjectivity there, except for like, oh, I like that or I don't like that.
Right. Harmonics are determined by your initial, like your fundamental frequency.
Yeah,
like
it's described in reference to the fundamental frequency, so there's no way for it to be interpreted differently.
Well, I'm just thinking of like the math of harmonics. Like it must be like each note will have its own harmonics, and then like it can only be that way because of like how the math works out.
Yeah, well, each note on each instrument, because each instrument has a different sort of overtone sequence.
Oh, really? Oh, okay, that's interesting then.
Yeah, so I showed you the one on guitar, but not every instrument is like that. Some have pretty different ones, radically different ones, actually. And that's how you get really weird sounding instruments.
Oh, they just like, I'm thinking of, I can't think of the name of the instrument from Australia.
Steel drum?
No. They just like add extra stuff behind your fundamental frequency, and then it like,
yeah,
depending on what you add behind it, really can change the sound of it. Okay.
Well, especially on lower tones, you can actually hear it a lot more. If you ever go near a grand piano or something, you should play one of the really low notes,
Right.
and you'll be able to pick out those other notes very easily.
The ones behind it.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. Because whenever you like listen to music or an instrument or something, you're just like hearing a note. It's just a note, right? But it's not. There's a bunch of stuff going on there.
Okay, listen. So this is an A, the lowest A on a piano.
Oh, I do hear. There's definitely more than one note happening.
You can, yeah, because it's so low, those higher notes are much easier to pick out.
Play it again.
It almost sounds like a chord, right?
It does sound like a chord.
But as you get higher, those quieter sound, the sounds you can actually hear get quieter and quieter. So string instruments tend to be similar, although not always the same. Wind instruments, same thing. Basically every category, brass, they have similar sorts of overtone series, and that's one of the reasons they sound kind of similar.
Even like human voice?
Yeah.
Like if I try to sing a C, there will be some background tones happening there.
Yeah. So you actually have some types of singing where you try to bring out the overtones.
Oh, I see.
I don't know if you've ever heard like yeah, there's like Himalayan and singing, and there's Inuit throat singing and things like that.
I've heard of throat singing.
Yeah, and typically they're manipulating the throat in a way to put more stress on the overtones. But however, it's not I wouldn't recommend doing that because it's pretty tough on your throat.
Right. Right. I mean, just listen to them. That sounds like it's destroying your throat.
Yeah. But you don't have to do that to get your overtones, because the overtones will always be present. If I just sing like
well, as we speak right now, are there overtones?
Yeah. Probably.
That's interesting.
If I go la, we could put that on the frequency thing, and we could isolate all the points. Exactly the same thing.
Very interesting.
It is so weird. I don't know, just seeing... they're waves, and it's weird that they're all waves, and it's weird that we both are working on waves in different ways, but
right.
with the same
different kinds of waves.
Fundamental mechanics. Yeah. And it's just another part where physics and music intersect in a way that's really interesting, because it's like you and I have both looked at basically the same chart with completely different understandings of different intentions and goals and understandings.
I'm trying to understand like atoms and electrons and stuff, and you're like making music, and we're like looking at the same chart.
But anyway, thank you guys for watching. Let us know if you have questions or comments and all that cool stuff.
Looking forward to the next one.
Sounds good. See ya.
Later.